Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony was written a little over a decade after his fourth. This symphony was first heard in November 1888 and immediately garnered negative reviews. Its early years were a hard, uphill slog to public acceptance. In a review of an 1892 performance in Boston for the Boston Evening Transcript, critic William Foster Apthorpe wrote, "In the finale we have all the untamed fury of the Cossack, whetting itself for deeds of atrocity against all the sterility of the Russian steppes. The furious peroration sounds like nothing so much as a horde of demons struggling in a torrent of brandy, the music growing drunker and drunker. Pandemonium, delirium tremens, raving, and above all, noise worse confounded." The composer himself had doubts about the piece, and it took several years for it to grow on him. He wrote to his patron that the audience seems to sense an insincere quality about it, and that perhaps they had a point. I find myself in agreement with critics who hear in the Fifth an uneven work, but it is, after all, one of a handful of such compositions that I discovered during my unhappy teenage years, and it spoke powerfully to me then and has the power to do so still, especially in this reading by Yevgeny Mravinsky. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to make a few connections that you might find interesting. In previous videos, I've commented on the fact that any time after 1805 that a composer wrote a symphony in E-flat major, comparisons with the Eroica were inevitable. Something like that applies here. After 1808, any composer aiming to write more than 4 symphonies was going to have to grapple with the legacy of Beethoven's Fifth. Again, comparisons will inevitably be made. Perhaps significantly, neither Schumann nor Brahms wrote more than 4, although both men were responding to Beethoven in practically every phrase they wrote. The Tchaikovsky Fifth, like that of Beethoven, is a minor key symphony that ends in the parallel major. The 4 movements follow the same traditional pattern, and although the final 2 movements are not linked in the present case as they are in the Beethoven, in performance you're apt to hear the finale follow close on the heels of movement 3 on account of the very satisfying sense of plagal resolution. Like Beethoven's seminal work, the present symphony begins with a stern presence that permeates the whole, and the overall trajectory is one of darkness to light, conflict ending in victory. The Beethoven Fifth must have been very much on Tchaikovsky's mind as he composed this one. It seems to me that Tchaikovsky's Fifth, like Beethoven's, has also had an enduring legacy, there being 2 later symphonies, both very much in the standard repertoire, also set in E minor and following the same 4-movement plan and almost certainly indebted to the present work. One is the E minor symphony of Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak, the last of his 9 compositions in that form. Dvorak's 9th was composed in 1893 in New York City, where the composer was heading a music conservatory. The Tchaikovsky Fifth was at that time very much in the air. The Dvorak Symphony has a title, From the New World. It is a musical letter home from America, a letter written by a homesick wayfarer. Its 4-movement outline tracks that of the Tchaikovsky Fifth very closely. Like its predecessor, the Dvorak work exhibits cyclic tendencies, with ideas presented in earlier movements reappearing in a transformed state in later ones. The final movement surrenders to the parallel major only grudgingly. Perhaps not coincidentally, prior to mid-century, when the Dvorak catalog was completed, the E minor symphony was known as his number 5. The other E minor symphony I have in mind is that of Finnish composer Jean Sibelius, written about 6 years later still, in 1899. The 4-movement plan is also faithfully observed here, and in this case, the mournful-sounding theme that opens the first movement, played by the clarinet, returns at the beginning of movement 4, but in the full orchestra, as in the present case, with all the orchestral strings singing the theme and the winds punctuating. Despite the close parallels, there are significant differences. In the case of the Sibelius work, the opening motto, I'm calling it that perhaps recklessly, but it does, after all, contribute melodic motives to the remaining movements. The opening motto returns to open the finale in the tonic minor instead of shifting to the glow of E major as in Tchaikovsky's work. And Sibelius's E minor symphony really does end in E minor, parting company with Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, and Dvorak. That's enough connections, and no, I'm not going to mention Brahms's E minor symphony since that's a horse of an entirely different color. So on to the work at hand. Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, which had appeared over a decade earlier, was a program symphony, and the composer had divulged its program to his patron, Nadezhda von Meck. Was the Fifth Symphony, written while the composer was still enjoying her patronage, also a program symphony? The answer to this is unclear. Tchaikovsky never directly alluded to any programmatic content in his Fifth, but the fact that the funereal music that opens Movement 1 reappears in various transformations during subsequent movements, and always at what appear to be significant moments, suggests that that music is no mere structural element, that it has some kind of extra musical significance. What is difficult to do is to tease out any coherent functional or psychological trajectory in those many reappearances. We're never in any doubt of that when we listen to the Symphonie Fantastique. Perhaps this was the dimension of the Fifth that left Tchaikovsky and this symphony's early audiences displeased. I'll take up these matters as they apply to the several movements as I treat them individually. The mood of Movement 1 is mostly somber, although the lovely waltz-like second theme does afford a heartwarming contrast to that general atmosphere. The movement opens with a solemn funeral march for clarinets in their hollow chalumeau register. Tchaikovsky referred to this melody as the symphony's core, and although he never attributed any extra musical significance to the theme, many commentators have heard in it the specter of fate, forever hovering over the rest of life. I have accordingly designated it the fate motto in my structural analysis and running commentary. The main body of the movement, which takes the usual sonata shape, begins with another march, this one in 6/8 time and marked Allegro con anima, its supple, wave-like theme first given by the clarinet and bassoon in octaves, an inspired instrumental choice. This theme, like the parallel theme in the Fourth Symphony, is worked out at length and constitutes a rich compendium of compositional techniques. The modulating transition, also like that of the Fourth, is very melodious and begins with a striking change of texture. The group of themes it leads to is simply wonderful. The second group opens with a joyful tune piped by the woodwinds and answered by the strings, an invitation to the dance. The syncopated waltz that follows represents Tchaikovsky at his very best. Did anyone ever write finer, more beautiful waltzes than this composer? The exposition closes in D major and opens out onto a rangy development section that rises to a peak of terrible intensity, and the beginning of the recapitulation, now scored for bassoon only, sounds cowed by what came shortly before. The first theme is somewhat truncated here, but not nearly so cruelly as in the Fourth Symphony, and the remainder of the recap is regular, bringing back the second group in the movement's tonic major key. The coda sloughs off those major key notes, however, and the movement ends in utter gloom. The slow movement is an ABA form essay set in the symphony's subtonic key, D major. Its opening chorale, a solemn passage for the orchestra's lower strings, begins in B minor but gradually finds the light, opening out onto a horn solo of rare beauty and tenderness. A deceptive cadence at a structural elision brings the arrival of an F-sharp major love duet for oboe and horn, colored by musical ecstasy. A complex, protracted interplay between the two themes we've heard so far, Theme 1 in the horn, Theme 2 in the oboe, constitutes the A section of this movement. I must note in passing that Theme 2 appears in two different forms, with the theme's distinctive head motive shared by those variants. The movement's F-sharp minor B section is extraordinarily melancholy and fraught with turmoil, and its impassioned unfolding is interrupted by a return to the opening movement's motto, now held harmonically off-center and striking a stern, commanding pose, not exactly brutal, but certainly unwelcome. Structurally speaking, this is the music that returns us to D major for the reprise of the A section. The music achieves something very much like triumph during this reprise, but the afterglow of its climax is shattered by disaster, the symphony's motto now charging onto the scene like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Tchaikovsky's musical response to this catastrophe is resignation, and the coda sinks gradually into silence, Theme 2's head motive falling gently through the octaves and finally laid to rest by a clarinet benediction. Movement 3 is an A major waltz with a contrasting scherzo-like F-sharp minor trio. This movement is quite regular in its construction and mostly well behaved. At the end of the waltz's da capo reprise, the symphony's motto ghosts quietly across the musical stage like an unhappy memory. The final movement is probably best understood as an E minor sonata form movement framed by an E major prologue and epilogue. The proportions, however, are such that the preponderance of the movement is set in major keys. The framing sections are, of course, major key transformations of the symphony's motto, which is present not only during those enclosing sections, but also does service as a member of the second group. I don't think there's a great deal more to tell you about this movement, since its design, although unusual, is unproblematic, and my running commentary will probably suffice to guide you through it. I do need to say a few words about one of the most notorious features of this symphony, however. At the culmination of the recapitulation, the music mounts furiously to a sustained climax on the dominant chord, which sets up the coda. The splendid hammered conclusion of that structural antecedent, reminiscent of the ending of the same composer's much earlier symphonic fantasy overture Romeo and Juliet, has led many an unwary audience into a premature ejaculation of applause, a mistake for which I think they may be forgiven in this particular instance. This is a classic claptrap in the original meaning of the word. It must have been on the mind of Finnish composer Jean Sibelius as he was penning the conclusion to his own Fifth Symphony 3 decades later. Those of you who are familiar with that splendid ending know exactly what I'm talking about.